In computing, a denial-of-service attack, Ddos attack, or distributed denial-of-service attack, Ddos attack, is an attempt to make a machine or network resource unavailable to its intended users. Although the means to carry out, motives for, and targets of a Ddos attack may vary, it generally consists of efforts to temporarily or indefinitely interrupt or suspend services of a host connected to the Internet. Perpetrators of Ddos attacks typically target sites or services hosted on high-profile web servers such as banks, credit card payment gateways, and even root NAMA servers. This technique has now seen extensive use in certain games, used by server owners, or disgruntled competitors on games. Increasingly, Ddos attacks have also been used as a form of resistance. Ddos, they say, is a tool for registering dissent. Richard Stallman has stated that Ddos is a form of Internet street protests. The term is generally used relating to computer networks, but is not limited to this field. For example, it is also used in reference to CPU resource management. One common method of attack involves saturating the target machine with external communications requests, so much so that it cannot respond to legitimate traffic, or responds so slowly as to be rendered essentially unavailable. Such attacks usually lead to a server overload. In general terms, Ddos attacks are implemented by either forcing the targeted computer or computers to reset, or consuming its resources, so that it can no longer provide its intended service, or obstructing the communication media between the intended users and the victim, so that they can no longer communicate adequately. Denial-of-service attacks are considered violations of the Internet Architecture Board's Internet Proper Use Policy, and also violate the acceptable use policies of virtually all Internet service providers. They also commonly constitute violations of the laws of individual nations. Symptoms and manifestations. The United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team, US CERT, defines symptoms of denial-of-service attacks to include unusually slow network performance, opening files or accessing websites, unavailability of a particular website, inability to access any website, dramatic increase in the number of spam emails received. This type of Ddos attack is considered an email bomb. Disconnection of a wireless or wired internet connection. Denial-of-service attacks can also lead to problems in the network branches around the actual computer being attacked. For example, the bandwidth of a router between the Internet and a LAN may be consumed by an attack, compromising not only the intended computer, but also the entire network or other computers on the LAN. If the attack is conducted on a sufficiently large scale, entire geographical regions of Internet connectivity can be compromised without the attacker's knowledge or intent by incorrectly configured, or flimsy network infrastructure equipment. Methods of attack. A denial-of-service attack is characterized by an explicit attempt by attackers to prevent legitimate users of a service from using that service. There are two general forms of Ddos attacks, those that crash services and those that flood services. A Ddos attack can be perpetrated in a number of ways. The 5 basic types of attack are: consumption of computational resources, such as bandwidth, disk space, or processor time. Disruption of configuration information, such as routing information. Disruption of state information, such as unsolicited resetting of TCP sessions. Disruption of physical network components. Obstructing the communication media between the intended users and the victim, so that they can no longer communicate adequately. A Ddos attack may include execution of malware intended to maximum out the processor's usage, preventing any work from occurring. Trigger errors in the microcode of the machine. Trigger errors in the sequencing of instructions, so as to force the computer into an unstable state or lock up. Exploit errors in the operating system, causing resource starvation and/or thrashing, that is to use up all available facilities, so no real work can be accomplished, or it can crash the system itself. Crash the operating system itself. In most cases, Ddos attacks involve forging of IP sender addresses, IP address spoofing, so that the location of the attacking machines cannot easily be identified, and to prevent filtering of the packets, based on the source address. Internet Control Message Protocol, Icmp, flood. A smooth attack is one particular variant of a flooding Ddos attack on the public Internet. It relies on misconfigured network devices that allow packets to be sent to all computer hosts on a particular network via the broadcast address of the network, rather than a specific machine. The network then serves as a smooth amplifier. In such an attack, the perpetrators will send large numbers of IRP packets with the source address faked to appear to be the address of the victim. The network's bandwidth is quickly used up, preventing legitimate packets from getting through to their destination. To combat denial-of-service attacks on the Internet, services like the Smooth Amplifier Registry have given network service providers the ability to identify misconfigured networks and to take appropriate action such as filtering. Ping flood is based on sending the victim an overwhelming number of ping packets, usually using the ping command from Unix-like hosts. The T-flag on Windows systems is much less capable of overwhelming a target. Also, the L size flag does not allow sent packet size greater than 65,500 in Windows. It is very simple to launch, the primary requirement being access to greater bandwidth than the victim. Ping of death is based on sending the victim a malformed ping packet, which might lead to a system crash. Syn or Syn flood. A Syn flood occurs when a host sends a flood of TCP/Syn packets, often with a forged sender address. Each of these packets is handled like a connection request, causing the server to spawn a half-open connection by sending back a TCP/Syn ACK packet, acknowledge, and waiting for a packet in response from the sender address, response to the ACK packet. However, because the sender address is forged, the response never comes. These half-open connections saturate the number of available connections the server is able to make, keeping it from responding to legitimate requests until after the attack ends. Teardrop attacks. A teardrop attack involves sending mangled IRP fragments with overlapping, oversized payloads to the target machine. This can crash various operating systems because of a bug in their TCP/IRP fragmentation reassembly code. Windows 3.1x, Windows 95 and Windows NT operating systems, as well as versions of Linux prior to versions 2.0.32 and the 2nd of January 1963 are vulnerable to this attack. Around September 2009, a vulnerability in Windows Vista was referred to as a teardrop attack, but the attack targeted SMB2, which is a higher layer than the TCP packets that Teardrop used. Low-rate denial-of-service attacks. The low-rate DOS, LDOS, attack exploits TCP's slow time-scale dynamics of retransmission timeout, RTO, mechanisms to reduce TCP throughput. Basically, an attacker can cause a TCP flow to repeatedly enter a RTO state by sending high-rate, but short-duration bursts, and repeating periodically at slow RTO time scales. The TCP throughput at the attacked node will be significantly reduced, while the attacker will have low average rate, making it difficult to be detected. Peer-to-peer attacks. Attackers have found a way to exploit a number of bugs in peer-to-peer servers to initiate DDoS attacks. The most aggressive of these peer-to-peer DOS attacks exploits DC++. Peer-to-peer attacks are different from regular botnet-based attacks. With peer-to-peer there is no botnet and the attacker does not have to communicate with the clients it subverts. Instead, the attacker acts as a puppet master, instructing clients of large peer-to-peer file-sharing hubs to disconnect from their peer-to-peer network and to connect to the victim's website instead. As a result, several thousand computers may aggressively try to connect to a target website. While a typical web server can handle a few hundred connections per second before performance begins to degrade, most web servers fail almost instantly under 5 or 6,000 connections per second. With a moderately large peer-to-peer attack, a site could potentially be hit with up to 750,000 connections in short order. The targeted web server will be plugged up by the incoming connections. While peer-to-peer attacks are easy to identify with signatures, the large number of IRP addresses that need to be blocked, often over 250,000 during the course of a large-scale attack, means that this type of attack can overwhelm mitigation defenses. Even if a mitigation device can keep blocking IRP addresses, there are other problems to consider. For instance, there is a brief moment where the connection is opened on the server side before the signature itself comes through. Only once the connection is open to the server can the identifying signature be sent and detected, and the connection torn down. Even tearing down connections takes server resources and can harm the server. This method of attack can be prevented by specifying in the peer-to-peer protocol which ports are allowed or not. If port 80 is not allowed, the possibilities for attack on websites can be very limited. Asymmetry of resource utilization in starvation attacks. An attack which is successful and consuming resources on the victim computer must be either carried out by an attacker with greater resources, by either controlling a computer with greater computation power, or, more commonly, large network bandwidth. Controlling a large number of computers and directing them to attack as a group. A DDoS attack is the primary example of this. Taking advantage of a property of the operating system or applications on the victim system, which enables an attack consuming vastly more of the victim's resources than the attackers. An asymmetric attack. Smurf attack, Syn Flood, Sockstress and NAPTHA attack are all asymmetric attacks. Permanent denial of service attacks. A permanent denial of service, PDoS, also known loosely as flashing, is an attack that damages a system so badly that it requires replacement or reinstallation of hardware. Unlike the distributed denial of service attack, a PDoS attack exploits security flaws which allow remote administration on the management interfaces of the victim's hardware, such as routers, printers, or other networking hardware. The attacker uses these vulnerabilities to replace a device's firmware with a modified, corrupt, or defective firmware image, a process which when done legitimately is known as flashing. This therefore bricks the device, rendering it unusable for its original purpose, until it can be repaired or replaced. The PDoS is a pure hardware-targeted attack which can be much faster, and requires fewer resources than using a botnet in a DDoS attack. Because of these features, and the potential and high probability of security exploits on network-enabled embedded devices, this technique has come to the attention of numerous hacker communities. Flashdance is a tool created by Rich Smith, an employee of Hewlett-Packard Systems Security Lab, used to detect and demonstrate PDoS vulnerabilities at the 2008 USEC West Applied Security Conference in London. Application-level floods. Various DOS-causing exploits such as buffer overflow can cause server-running software to get confused and fill the disk space, or consume all available memory or CPU time. Other kinds of DOS rely primarily on brute force, flooding the target with an overwhelming flux of packets, oversaturating its connection bandwidth, or depleting the target's system resources. Bandwidth-saturating floods rely on the attacker having higher bandwidth available than the victim. A common way of achieving this today is via distributed denial of service, employing a botnet. Other floods may use specific packet types or connection requests to saturate finite resources by, for example, occupying the maximum number of open connections, or filling the victim's disk space with logs. A banana attack is another particular type of DOS. It involves redirecting outgoing messages from the client back onto the client, preventing outside access, as well as flooding the client with the sent packets. An attacker with shallow-level access to a victim's computer may slow it until it is unusable, or crash it by using a fork bomb. A kind of application-level DOS attack is XDOS, or XML DOS, which can be controlled by modern web application firewalls, WAFs. Nuke. A nuke is an old denial-of-service attack against computer networks consisting of fragmented, or otherwise invalid Icmp packets sent to the target, achieved by using a modified ping utility to repeatedly send this corrupt data, thus slowing down the affected computer until it comes to a complete stop. A specific example of a nuke attack that gained some prominence is the WinNuke, which exploited the vulnerability in the NetBIOS handler in Windows 95. A string of out-of-band data was sent to TCP port 139 of the victim's machine, causing it to lock up and display a blue screen of death, BSOD. OWASP HTTP Post Denial of Service Tool. From the Authority of Web Application Security OWASP Foundation, the OWASP HTTP Post tool completes the request header's phase, however it sends the request body, post payload, very slowly, for instance, 1 byte/110 seconds. When you consider that, by default, Apache will accept a request body of up to 2 GB in size, you can see how effective this attack can be. Are you dead yet, Rudy? This attack is one of many web application DOS tools available to directly attack web applications by starvation of available sessions on the web server. Much like slow LoRa's, Rudy keeps sessions at halt using never-ending post transmissions, and sending an arbitrarily large content length header value. Slow read attack. Slow read attack sends legitimate application layer requests, but reads responses very slowly, thus trying to exhaust the server's connection pool. Slow reading is achieved by advertising very small number for the TCP receive window size, and at the same time, by emptying client's TCP receive buffer slowly. That naturally ensures a very low data flow rate. Distributed attack. A distributed denial of service attack, DDoS, occurs when multiple systems flood the bandwidth or resources of a targeted system, usually one or more web servers. This is the result of multiple compromised systems, for example a botnet, flooding the targeted system or systems with traffic. When a server is overloaded with connections, new connections can no longer be accepted. Malware can carry DDoS attack mechanisms. One of the better-known examples of this was MyDoom. Its DOS mechanism was triggered on a specific date and time. This type of DDoS involved hard-coding the target IP address prior to release of the malware, and no further interaction was necessary to launch the attack. A system may also be compromised with the Trojan, allowing the attacker to download a zombie agent, or the Trojan may contain one. Attackers can also break into systems using automated tools that exploit flaws in programs that listen for connections from remote hosts. This scenario primarily concerns systems acting as servers on the web. Teardrop is a classic example of a DDoS tool. It utilizes a layered structure, where the attacker uses a client program to connect to handlers, which are compromised systems that issue commands to the zombie agents, which in turn facilitate the DDoS attack. Agents are compromised via the handlers by the attacker, using automated routines to exploit vulnerabilities in programs that accept remote connections running on the targeted remote hosts. Each handler can control up to 1,000 agents. These collections of systems compromises are known as botnets. DDoS tools like Teardrop still use classic DOS attack methods centered on IP spoofing and amplification like smurf attacks and fraggle attacks. These are also known as bandwidth consumption attacks. Syn Floods, also known as resource starvation attacks, may also be used. Newer tools can use DNS servers for DOS purposes. See next section. Simple attacks such as Syn Floods may appear with a wide range of source IP addresses, giving the appearance of a well-distributed DOS. These flood attacks do not require completion of the TCP three-way handshake and attempt to exhaust the destination SYN queue or the server bandwidth. Because the source IP addresses can be trivially spoofed, an attack could come from a limited set of sources, or may even originate from a single host. Stack enhancements such as SYN cookies may be effective mitigation against SYN queue flooding. However, complete bandwidth exhaustion may require involvement. Further explanation needed. Unlike MyDoom's DDoS mechanism, botnets can be turned against any IP address. Script kiddies use them to deny the availability of well-known websites to legitimate users. More sophisticated attackers use DDoS tools for the purposes of extortion, even against their business rivals. If an attacker mounts an attack from a single host, it would be classified as a DOS attack. In fact, any attack against availability would be classed as a denial of service attack. On the other hand, if an attacker uses many systems to simultaneously launch attacks against a remote host, this would be classified as a DDoS attack. The major advantages to an attacker of using a distributed denial of service attack are that multiple machines can generate more attack traffic than one machine, multiple attack machines are harder to turn off than one attack machine, and that the behavior of each attack machine can be stealthier, making it harder to track and shut down. These attacker advantages cause challenges for defense mechanisms. For example, merely purchasing more incoming bandwidth than the current volume of the attack might not help, because the attacker might be able to simply add more attack machines. In some cases, a machine may become part of a DDoS attack with the owner's consent, for example, in Operation Payback, organized by the group Anonymous. Reflected/spoofed attack. A distributed reflected denial of service attack, DDoS, involves sending forged requests of some type to a very large number of computers that will reply to the requests. Using Internet Protocol address spoofing, the source address is set to that of the targeted victim, which means all the replies will go to, and flood, the target. Icmp echo request attacks, Smurf attack, can be considered one form of reflected attack, as the flooding host or hosts send echo requests to the broadcast addresses of misconfigured networks, thereby entice many hosts to send echo reply packets to the victim. Some early DDoS programs implemented a distributed form of this attack. Many services can be exploited to act as reflectors, some harder to block than others. DNS amplification attacks involve a new mechanism that increase the amplification effect, using a much larger list of DNS servers than seen earlier. Telephony denial of service. Voice over IP has made abusive origination of large numbers of telephone voice calls inexpensive and readily automatized, while permitting call origins to be misrepresented through caller ID spoofing. According to the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, TDOS has appeared as part of various fraudulent schemes. A scammer contacts the victim's banker or broker, impersonating the victim to request a funds transfer. The bankers attempt to contact the victim for verification of the transfer fails as the victim's telephone lines are being flooded with thousands of bogus calls, rendering the victim unreachable. A scammer contacts consumers with a bogus claim to collect an outstanding payday loan for thousands of dollars. When the consumer objects, the scammer retaliates by flooding the victim's employer with thousands of automated calls. In some cases, displayed caller ID is spoofed to impersonate police or law enforcement agencies. A scammer contacts consumers with a bogus debt collection demand, and threatens to send police. When the victim balks, the scammer floods local police numbers with calls on which caller ID is spoofed to display the victim's number. Police soon arrive at the victim's residence attempting to find the origin of the calls. Telephony denial of service can exist even without internet telephony. In the 2002 New Hampshire Senate election phone jamming scandal, telemarketers were used to flood political opponents with spurious calls to jam phone banks on election day. Widespread publication of a number can also flood it with enough calls to render it unusable, as happened with multiple +1 area code -867-5309 subscribers inundated by hundreds of misdialed calls daily in response to a popular song. 867-5309/Jenny. TDOS differs from other telephone harassment, such as prank calls and obscene phone calls, by the number of calls originated. By occupying lines continuously with repeated automated calls, the victim is prevented from making or receiving both routine and emergency telephone calls. Unintentional denial of service. This describes a situation where a website ends up denied, not due to a deliberate attack by a single individual or group of individuals, but simply due to a sudden enormous spike in popularity. This can happen when an extremely popular website posts a prominent link to a second less well-prepared site, for example, as part of a news story. The result is that a significant proportion of the primary site's regular users, potentially hundreds of thousands of people, click that link in the space of a few hours, having the same effect on the target website as a DDoS attack. A VIPDOS is the same, but specifically when the link was posted by a celebrity. When Michael Jackson died in 2009, websites such as Google and Twitter slowed down or even crashed. Many sites' servers thought the requests were from a virus or spyware trying to cause a denial of service attack, warning users that their queries looked like automated requests from a computer virus or spyware application. News sites and link sites, sites whose primary function is to provide links to interesting content elsewhere on the internet, are most likely to cause this phenomenon. The canonical example is the /dirt effect when receiving traffic from /dirt. Sites such as Reddit, Dig, The Drudge Report, Fuck, Something Awful, and the webcomic Penny Arcade have their own corresponding effects, known as DDoS of love, the Diggy effect, being drudged, fucking, goonishing and banging, respectively. Routers have also been known to create unintentional DOS attacks, as both D-Link and NetG routers have created NTP vandalism, by flooding NTP servers without respecting the restrictions of client types or geographical limitations. Similar unintentional denials of service can also occur via other media, for instance when a URL is mentioned on television. If a server is being indexed by Google or another search engine during peak periods of activity, or does not have a lot of available bandwidth while being indexed, it can also experience the effects of a DOS attack. Legal action has been taken in at least one such case. In 2006, Universal Tube and Rollform Equipment Corporation sued YouTube. Massive numbers of would-be YouTube.com users accidentally typed the tube company's URL, youtube.com. As a result, the tube company ended up having to spend large amounts of money on upgrading their bandwidth. Denial of service level second. The goal of DOS-L2, possibly DDoS, attack is to cause a launching of a defense mechanism which blocks the network segment from which the attack originated. In case of distributed attack or IP header modification, that depends on the kind of security behavior. It will fully block the attack network from internet, but without system crash. Performing DOS attacks. A wide array of programs are used to launch DOS attacks. Most of these programs are completely focused on performing DOS attacks, while others are also true packet injectors, thus able to perform other tasks as well. Such tools are intended for benign use, but they can also be utilized in launching attacks on victim networks. Handling. Defensive responses to denial of service attacks typically involves the use of a combination of attack detection, traffic classification and response tools, aiming to block traffic that they identify as illegitimate, and allowed traffic that they identify as legitimate. A list of prevention and response tools is provided below. Firewalls. Firewalls can be set up to have simple rules such to allow or deny protocols, ports or IP addresses. In the case of a simple attack coming from a small number of unusual IP addresses, for instance, one could put up a simple rule to drop all incoming traffic from those attackers. More complex attacks will however be hard to block with simple rules. For example, if there is an ongoing attack on port 80, web service, it is not possible to drop all incoming traffic on this port, because doing so will prevent the server from serving legitimate traffic. Additionally, firewalls may be too deep in the network hierarchy. Routers may be affected before the traffic gets to the firewall. Nonetheless, firewalls can effectively prevent users from launching simple flooding-type attacks from machines behind the firewall. Some stateful firewalls, like OpenBSD's PF4 packet filter, can act as a proxy for connections. The handshake is validated with the client, instead of simply forwarding the packet to the destination. It is available for other BSDs as well. In that context, it is called Syn proxy. Switches. Most switches have some rate limiting and ACL capability. Some switches provide automatic and/or system-wide rate limiting, traffic shaping, delay binding, TCP splicing, deep packet inspection and bogon filtering, bogus IP filtering, to detect and remediate denial of service attacks through automatic rate filtering, and one-link failover and balancing. These schemes will work as long as the DOS attacks are something that can be prevented by using them. For example, Syn Flood can be prevented using delay binding or TCP splicing. Similarly, content-based DOS may be prevented using deep packet inspection. Attacks originating from dark addresses or going to dark addresses can be prevented using bogon filtering. Automatic rate filtering can work as long as you have set rate thresholds correctly and granularly. One-link failover will work as long as both links have DOS/DOS prevention mechanism. Routers. Similar to switches, routers have some rate limiting and ACL capability. They too are manually set. Most routers can be easily overwhelmed under a DOS attack. Cisco OS has features that prevent flooding, that is example settings. Application front-end hardware. Application front-end hardware is intelligent hardware placed on the network before traffic reaches the servers. It can be used on networks in conjunction with routers and switches. Application front-end hardware analyzes data packets as they enter the system, and then identifies them as priority, regular, or dangerous. There are more than 25 bandwidth management vendors. IPS-based prevention. Intrusion prevention systems, IPS, are effective if the attacks have signatures associated with them. However, the trend among the attacks is to have legitimate content but bad intent. Intrusion prevention systems which work on content recognition cannot block behavior-based DOS attacks. An ASIC-based IPS may detect and block denial of service attacks because they have the processing power and the granularity to analyze the attacks and act like a circuit breaker in an automated way. A rate-based IPS, RBIPS, must analyze traffic granularly and continuously monitor the traffic pattern and determine if there is traffic anomaly. It must let the legitimate traffic flow, while blocking the Ddos Attack traffic. DDoS-based defense. More focused on the problem than IPS, a Ddos defense system, DDS, is able to block connection-based Ddos attacks and those with legitimate content but bad intent. A DDS can also address both protocol attacks, such as teardrop and ping of death, and rate-based attacks, such as Icmp floods and Syn Floods. Blackholing and sinkholing. With blackholing, all the traffic to the attacked DNS or IP address is sent to a black hole null interface or a non-existent server. To be more efficient, and avoid affecting network connectivity, it can be managed by the Icmp. Sinkholing routes traffic to a valid IP address which analyzes traffic, and rejects bad packets. Sinkholing is not efficient for most severe attacks. Clean pipes. All traffic is passed through a cleaning center or a scrubbing center via various methods such as proxies, tunnels or even direct circuits, which separates bad traffic, DDoS and also other common internet attacks, and only sends good traffic beyond to the server. The provider needs central connectivity to the internet to manage this kind of service, unless they happen to be located within the same facility as the cleaning center or scrubbing center. Prolexic data communications, ATN and TN Verizon are examples of providers of this service. Backscatter. And computer network security. Backscatter is a side effect of a spoof denial of service attack. In this kind of attack, the attacker spoofs, or forges, the source address in IP packets sent to the victim. In general, the victim machine cannot distinguish between the spoofed packets and legitimate packets, so the victim responds to the spoofed packets as it normally would. These response packets are known as backscatter. If the attacker is spoofing source addresses randomly, the backscatter response packets from the victim will be sent back to random destinations. This effect can be used by network telescopes as indirect evidence of such attacks. The term backscatter analysis refers to observing backscatter packets arriving at a statistically significant portion of the IP address space, to determine characteristics of Ddos attacks and victims. Legality. This section requires expansion. January 2011. In the Police and Justice Act 2006, the United Kingdom specifically outlawed denial of service attacks and set a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. In the US, denial of service attacks may be considered a federal crime under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act with penalties that include years of imprisonment. Many other countries have similar laws. Non-primary source needed. The U.S. situation is under court ruling with a case in California. On January 7, 2013, Anonymous posted a petition on the WhiteHouse.gov site asking that DDoS be recognized as a legal form of protest similar to the Occupy protests. 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 Form of